This is no different from the discussion about God's existence. And I'm going to explain why. But before I do that, let me just give you a few more concepts about what I mean by self-evident truths. So we say that self-evident truth is something that is true by default. Now, it doesn't mean self-evident truths are always going to be the same. They may change. I'm up to that kind of scenario, right? Self-evident truths may change over time. However, the default position is when something is true by default, you accept it unless there's direct evidence to challenge it. Okay? Now, one may ask, Hamza's making this up, man. He's making this up. He's playing trickery, creating this idea of self-evident truth in order to fudge God into the equation, right? What is this self-evident truth? He's making it up just so he could create some kind of fake confidence in Muslims. Hold on a second. Let's turn down the arrogance knob a little bit. Self-evident truths permeate every single field of philosophy, science, mathematics, Western thought. Let me repeat. The idea of things being true by default, things being self-evidently true, permeate all aspects of thinking, even science itself. I know. I just finished studying 2 postgraduate degrees in philosophy, and we did philosophy of science, we did philosophy of psychology, we did the philosophy of language, we did all of these things, and I'm telling you, you would realize that there are things that are considered true by default, that don't need any proof, that they start with in order to develop their knowledge further. Take, for example, my specialist module called The Idea of Freedom. It was political philosophy. And we had a postgraduate discussion. In the seminar period, you have discussions with your fellow postgrads, and you have a bit of a debate and a discussion. And the discussion was on the idea of hurriya, freedom, right? And there was 2 opinions. That freedom is intrinsic, meaning you don't need any evidence that freedom is like a virtue, something that we should work towards. But others said, no, freedom is only good because it's instrumental. It's a means to an end. So some philosophers would argue freedom is an end. Others would argue it's a means to an end. And I asked the question, and because the majority of them believe that freedom has intrinsic value, meaning it's an end, it's not just a means. And therefore it doesn't really need proof from that point of view because it's intrinsically valuable. So I said to them, well, how do you know? Well, he said, well, for me to start to prove it means that freedom is not intrinsically valuable anymore. I said, yeah, but you must have a basis for this. And this is what the professor, the academic said. He said, it's based on our intuitions. And then I said to him, really? And he replied, what else do we have? His intuition. His intuition. Fair enough. But the point I'm trying to say, even in political philosophy, things like freedom and other concepts and ideas are based on what they would consider true by default. That trusting your intuition is true by default from this point of view. Take, for example, things in the philosophy of science. If you study the philosophy of science, for some conceptions of the scientific method, you have to have something that you believe to be true by default. What is that thing? That the real world exists. This bottle really exists. It's outside of my head. This bottle is not just an idea here, it's outside of my head. I'm touching it and I'm feeling it. You have to start with that position, because after all, there is no real proof that this bottle is external to my brain. But you'd be like, but I can see it, bro, and you can touch it and feel it. Fair enough, but it could just be all an idea in my head. Maybe my mind is on planet Mars and there are metal probes in my brain and there's an alien making me think and feel what I'm thinking and feeling now. I don't know if you guys ever watched the film The Matrix. Maybe we're in the Matrix, right? What are you going to take, the blue pill or the red pill? The point I'm trying to say here is they have to work with that true by default assumption, the self-evident truth that the external world exists. Not only that, in the philosophy of science, and you could read this for yourself, a true by default self-evident truth is that external causal connections exist. So there are things that happen in the world and they're causally connected. Another true by default assumption or self-evident truth in the philosophy of science is that nature is uniform. Nature is uniform. Like if you see a certain pattern, it's more likely to repeat itself across reality. So the point is, there are self-evident truths in philosophy of politics, in philosophy of science. Also, even in metaphysics, the idea that we have minds. Do you have a mind, bro? Do you have a mind? You think so? Well, the minute you say, I think, you have a mind, right? You must have a mind. So this guy has a mind. I want him to prove to us he has a mind. How do we know you're not just a zombie, bro, that you've been programmed biologically like this? I think, therefore I am. But maybe you've been programmed to say, I think, therefore I am. Do I have another mind? Do I have a mind? The point is, we all believe that we all have minds, right? But we don't have any what you would call absolute proof that this guy is really a human being with another mind. He may be just a biological zombie, and I'm the only one with a mind. This is called solipsism, right? The point I'm trying to say here is, we use that as an assumption. In metaphysics, when you're studying consciousness, right, you assume everyone has minds. And you take that as true by default. So the point I'm trying to say here, brothers and sisters, is that this idea of self-evident truth, this idea of being true by default, is not something I've made up. It exists everywhere. Everywhere. In science, in politics, in philosophy, in mathematics even. If you study, for example, the philosophy of mathematics, when they do set theory or calculus, there is an assumption that they believe is true by default. What's that assumption? Infinity exists. No evidence. They just say it exists. They have to start with that in order to have their mathematical knowledge.